There's been a lot of talk here about a new norm called disruption. At least that's according to new research out by Alex Partners. And pleased to say joining us right now is the executive chairman of Alex Partners, Simon Freakley. Great to see you, Simon.
Ryan, great to be here.
To say that we're in an age of disruption might be an understatement, particularly after what we saw last year. I don't know who was naive enough to think that 2026 might be a little calmer, but we're already off to a fast and furious start. And it gets to the idea that when you are advising these executives, talking to the executives, picking their brains here, do they feel any sort of sense of clarity or comfort to a better degree than maybe what they saw in 2025?
Well, this is the 7th year, Romain, we've done our disruption index.
Yeah.
3,200 executives, 11 of the world's biggest economies, 10 of the biggest industries. The world is as disrupted today as it's ever been in our study. But a couple of interesting insights. One is that CEOs seem to be thinking this is normal. They're getting better at managing in this multiple and intense disruption environment. But they are very anxious. They're anxious because the pace and the intensity is such that will they keep up? Will they be able to pivot quickly enough to adapt? And interestingly enough, about 15 to 17% of these companies, we call them growth leaders, are actually doing incredibly well in this environment. They're outperforming their markets and their competitors in revenue growth and earnings growth. So it's a time of opportunity as well as a time of challenge.
Well, I want to talk about both of that, the opportunity and challenge, but I want to stay on the challenge for just 1 second here. When they start to see headlines from, Trump saying, I want to cap credit card rates, or I want to ban, investors from buying single-family homes, are you still seeing CEOs react to that immediately, or is it kind of like, okay, we don't know where this is going, let's just wait and see, get more details, and then we'll formulate a plan?
Well, the CEOs I speak to every day, what they've got really good at now is understanding there are going to be disruptions. They don't know exactly what they're going to be, but there will be more disruptions rolling out month in, month out. They've got much better at not reacting or overreacting to a particular single disruption. They're getting better at managing the complexity of them. They're planning for multiple outcomes. They're not being a hostage of one strategy. They're pivoting very quickly. They're leaning in. It's leadership by leaning in, really. They're being ruthless in their capital allocation. They're being ruthless in their prioritization. They're getting rid of non-core assets. They're prioritizing M&A where they think they'll make a difference. So they're getting much better at it, Romain.
Well, that gets to the idea of opportunity. And I remember, I don't know if maybe we can draw a parallel, but I remember during the COVID and all the big supply chain disruptions that we saw then. And companies were really shook by that. But it was also interesting to see how those companies updated their supply chains in a way that they probably would not have done and that they probably should have done years prior. And a lot of them came out of it much healthier, a much more efficient supply chain line. And I am curious as to whether the disruption we're seeing now on a slightly different front with geopolitics, that does end up being kind of the catalyst to improve these companies in a way that might not have happened.
Well, it turned out, of course, that COVID was a dry run. That people had these wonderful just-in-time supply chains, and they realized they didn't have a just-in-case supply chain. So they had to quickly pivot, not just to what they could get globally, but what regional supply chains would provide, what local supply chains would provide. So having got through COVID, when disruptions continued, and of course, tariffs became a real issue, they had done this once. They knew what the playbook was. It's interesting how quickly CEOs around the world have been able to digest tariffs, have repurposed manufacturing capabilities, shifted contracts to optimize in this new tariff environment. So I think, if there's another wave of tariffs, there's another type of disruption that will impact supply chains, geopolitical developments, for instance, I think people are much more practiced at this now. They're better at it. They're expecting it.
I do have to ask you, the World Economic Forum is kicking off in a couple of days in Switzerland. The President of the United States is going to make a big presence there. He's given a keynote speech there on his economic policies. He's taken a huge delegation of advisors and cabinet leaders here. Is the presence of the United States going to be the dominant one at this conference?
Well, the US is the dominant economy, so of course they'll play a very important part in the discussion. But it's fantastic, I think, that the US is getting involved in the World Economic Forum or that global discussion in such a material way, because they're a very important player. But it's an impressive turnout, actually, of political leaders as well as business leaders this year, maybe even the best turnout ever. So I think there'll be rich discussions. I'm personally delighted that the US will be in the middle of it.
Well, I bring that up because, we know the US has been the focal point of the global economy, and for good reason. For decades. There's a lot of concern, or I just say concern, but there's a lot of people pontificating that might be shifting, a slow shift, but it is a tectonic shift. Yeah. So that maybe it might necessarily be one singular country, but we might have a more regional breakdown where maybe China rules the East, maybe the US rules the West, and who knows what rules in between. But do you see a bit more of a split and divergence in the global economy, in the global structure?
Well, I think that for the last 35 years, we've lived in this extraordinary global super cycle where the world has been largely flat. There's been little friction in the movement of goods or services or capital. And the world, through populist governments around the world, are reshaping the polarity of the world. Obviously, I get to see from the privilege of a front row seat with our clients every day how business leaders are dealing with this, and they're pivoting and trying to work out in global businesses or even international businesses how best to adapt to that. There's clearly a repositioning going on, and business leaders are trying their very best to read that and make the business decisions that leave their enterprises as best placed as possible.
What are you hearing in terms of the most optimism out there with regards to sort of what people are looking towards, what people think not just are going to drive their individual businesses, but really, the economy overall?
Well, in our survey, 3,200 executives around the world, I mean, the vast majority of executives are optimistic about AI. They're optimistic not just about the efficiency that AI can drive in their businesses, but also how it can drive revenue growth. So we touched on these growth leaders earlier. The majority of those growth leaders are really understanding how these tools and these capabilities can drive the performance of their business at the top line and the bottom line. So I think a large amount of optimism about AI, but a real sense of anxiety. They're not moving quickly enough to capitalize on those new capabilities.
Simon, always a pleasure.
Great to see you.
Simon Freakley is the executive chairman over at Alex Partners, and we should point out Alex Partners has a new report out here on their disruption index, I should say, for the 7th straight year.